and the level of destruction was enormous. You couldn't tell that you had an Airbus A310 aircraft there. I mean, you couldn't even tell you had two engines.
At 8:19 p.m., TWA Flight 800 is airborne.
Talk to me. What do you have for us?
Without warning, a powerful explosion tears the fuselage apart. Debris from TWA Flight 800 litters the water nearly 75 miles east of Manhattan. Investigators begin the painstaking task of piecing together what happened to TWA 800. The NTSB's lead investigator, Al Dickinson, faces an urgent task.
It was extremely important for us to find out what happened because there were so many 747s flying at that time.
The NTSB will lead the investigation.
This is a half-mile block here.
While the FBI launches a parallel criminal inquiry.
You know, that people think this is exclusive jurisdiction of the NTSB. That's not correct. If it's a criminal matter, we have to get out there right away.
The FBI believes they may already have an explanation for the disaster over Long Island. 3 years earlier, in 1993, terrorists drove a bomb into the World Trade Center. Just over a year before, Timothy McVeigh bombed the Federal Building in Oklahoma. Now, the mid-air explosion of TWA 800 is also being linked to terrorism.
It was all over the news how people thought they saw something going up to hit an aircraft. A lot of them thought they saw missiles.
NTSB investigators spend weeks carefully searching for any sign of foul play. They study wreckage from almost every part of the 230-foot-long plane.
Pretty much during the whole time we were there, we were looking for something that would support any kind of missile or bomb.
They find no signs of an explosive device.
No pitting, no cratering, nothing.
We didn't find the soot patterns in a radiating pattern that might have been from a bomb. We didn't find this micro cratering where a hot piece of metal are impacting other pieces of metal.
It wasn't a bomb.
No piece had any evidence of a bomb at all.
NTSB investigators believe it was an exploding fuel tank that took down TWA 800, but they still don't know what sparked the blast.
We need to prove three things. The fuel was flammable. The explosion has to be powerful enough to rupture the tank. And finally, something created a spark to ignite the fuel. Let's start with the first one. Flammability.
Jet fuel in its liquid form is not flammable, but when heated, the fuel starts to vaporize. When combined with oxygen already present in the tank, this vapor can become highly flammable. At the altitude where TWA 800 exploded, almost 14,000 feet, jet fuel needs to reach 96 degrees Fahrenheit before it can ignite. There's just one problem.
The manufacturer said, well, it never gets that hot in there.
According to Boeing, the fuel tanks housed inside the wings would never get hot enough for the fuel to vaporize. On the day of the fatal flight, the temperature at JFK Airport hit 87 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the flash point for jet fuel. The NTSB's theory may be wrong. Investigators examine the design schematics of the aircraft. An intriguing detail catches their attention.
I remember learning that the placement of the air conditioning units were underneath the center tank, and those generate a fair amount of heat.
They cool the aircraft, but the packs themselves get quite hot during that procedure.
On TWA 800, the air conditioning units were working extra hard to keep the cabin cool on a hot evening.
The air conditioning packs underneath the center wing fuel tank had been operating for, I believe, several hours prior to takeoff.
Could heat from the units have boosted the temperature inside the tanks to a dangerously high level?
There's only one way to find out.
The only way we were going to determine the actual conditions inside the fuel tank was by performing a flight test.
They decide to reproduce the exact conditions of the accident flight.
All right, let's start it up.
The same type of plane, the same fuel load, and most importantly, exactly the same air conditioning units. It's a risky undertaking, filled with uncertainties. The test flight reaches the same altitude as TWA 800.
Holy crow.
The temperature readings are terrifying.
These air conditioner packs were getting up to 350 degrees. 350 degrees is about what you turn your oven to bake a chicken.
This is off the charts.
The temperature in the tank hits 127 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees above the flash point.
Okay, let's get back down to the ground.
Investigators are now certain that the fuel in the tanks of TWA 800 did become flammable. Investigators know the Northwest Airlink Flight 5719 pilots could not have heard a low-altitude warning. But they still don't understand why the plane was descending so rapidly. They wonder if weather conditions may have played a role. They check the temperatures and the type of precipitation encountered by the turboprop.
These are prime conditions for icing. Plane would have descended right through it.
Investigators need to know how bad the icing conditions were just before the crash.
Just wondering if you have a couple of minutes.
They talk to other pilots who flew into Hibbing that night.
So you were aware of the potential for icing during your approach into Hibbing?
The pilots tell Velisi they faced moderate icing conditions.
But why would these two pilots start their descent so late?
They also describe a common technique used to prevent ice accumulation. It now seems the rapid descent was not due to a loss of control caused by icing. Instead, it looks like it was part of a deliberate strategy to avoid icing. Finally, investigators get the evidence they've been waiting for: the cockpit voice recording.
All right, everybody ready? Play the tape.
The investigators listen carefully to the recording. It's what is not said that alarms them the most.
Why isn't the first officer making his altitude callouts?
First Officer Erickson should be telling his captain how close they are to their minimum altitude and warning him when they descend past it. But he does neither.
Gear down.
Flaps 20.
He never told the captain how close they were getting to the ground.
Captain Fallitz has his hands full landing the plane. He expects his first officer to keep an eye on their altitude. But on this flight, the first officer never once reports the altitude as the plane speeds closer and closer to the ground. The CDR leads investigators to wonder, was the loss of 18 lives in the Hibbing crash due to the failings of an inexperienced young pilot? Captain Falitz was known as a skilled senior pilot, but a deeper look reveals a man with a troubling record.
When we looked at the captain's training records, we began to understand that he had some previous issues in his flight training.
Boom, boom, boom.
Soon after he joined the company, he failed his oral exam. He failed 2 more proficiency exams in his career. That's unusual for a professional pilot to fail that many times.
The problems hadn't been tracked by anybody in the organization because they had failed at different locations. So nobody put everything together until we did.
Some of the instructor pilots were noting that his cockpit resource management wasn't up to par, and they had a tendency to be domineering in the cockpit.
Well, he had an issue with dealing with other people.
Are all these formal complaints against Captain Falitz?
Marvin was the first captain I flew with after my IOE, my initial operating experience, and he tended to be a little bit domineering and would berate you and was intolerant of mistakes and really not a particularly great instructor pilot.
Wow.
Perhaps the most disturbing complaint against Captain Falitz is that he once physically struck a colleague in anger.
For a professional pilot to physically have an altercation or attempt to, quote, discipline a fellow employee is totally unacceptable.
I don't get it. What was making this guy so angry?
You gotta be freaking kidding me.
According to people who knew him, Captain Falitz's morale took a big hit when Northwest Airlink instituted a new residence policy for their pilots.
About a year before, the company, for cost-saving purposes, started a new policy where they required the pilots to reside at their outstations. These would be small towns outside of Minneapolis.
Investigators make another disturbing discovery. Captain Falitz would sometimes be deliberately rough with the flight controls.
His way of getting revenge on the company was to sometimes take it out on the passengers.
I was amazed when I read that, to tell you the truth. And I was amazed that a person would intentionally make a rough flight to make people mad, because what good does that do? This guy, from what I understand, he did it because he wanted to punish the airline.
As more and more details about the captain's personality emerge, investigators are forced to consider a troubling question.
Could his anger somehow have caused this crash?
The morning after the crash, a blackened scar on a frozen field marks the fatal impact zone of Flight 3272. A team from the National Transportation Safety Board is already at work recovering pieces of wreckage for analysis. Investigators head to Detroit Metropolitan Airport. They want to hear from the last person to speak with the pilots, the approach controller.
It was coming on rush hour. We had winter weather.
From air traffic control, we learned that the weather was bad and airplanes were starting to pile up on their approach into Detroit.
I made sure there was plenty of distance between them.
There were other airplanes on approach to Detroit, so sometimes when they're in close proximity, there can be an issue with a wake vortex coming off one airplane that may affect another.
A wake vortex is a horizontal tornado that trails behind an aircraft. If one plane flies too close to the wake of another, it can encounter sudden and extreme turbulence.
So, here's the Airbus, American West Airlines Flight 50.
The Airbus is almost twice the size of the Embraer 120. A wake vortex incident seems possible. But investigators won't know for certain until experts at NASA analyze the radar data.
And that settles that.
But it's another dead end.
wasn't a wake vortex.
The analysis reveals that the wake from American Airlines Flight 50 could not have dropped to the altitude of Comair 3272. Investigators are back where they started. Why 29 people died just minutes before landing is still a mystery. NTSB systems specialist John DeLisi faces one of the biggest challenges of his career.
We knew the airplane was on approach into Detroit, and something dramatic happened. Something went wrong suddenly.
What a mess.
The NTSB's Richard Rodriguez leads the investigation.
Our mission is to find the cause of an accident, make recommendations that will prevent it from ever happening again.
He's very familiar with this type of plane, having investigated previous accidents involving the Embraer 120.
The Embraer 120 propeller blade had separated due to a fatigue crack over in an accident earlier in Georgia, and the crew was able to land it, but it was very difficult to control.
In two previous cases, part of a propeller blade broke off in mid-flight. Could it have happened again? Rodriguez reviews details of where the two propellers were found at the Detroit crash site. He makes a troubling discovery. Part of one blade ended up 75 feet away from the main impact crater. He can't help but wonder, is this the third time he's seen an Embraer 120 propeller fail?
We need to take a look at those propeller blades.
We wanted to get those blades of the propeller to ensure they were intact at impact.
Rodriguez studies the blade fragment, looking for evidence of failure. If the propeller blades were all attached and spinning at impact, they would have all hit the ground with tremendous force, resulting in distinctive damage on every blade.
This is impact damage. We're spinning right to the end.
The analysis leaves no doubt. Though the propellers fragmented when they hit the ground, they did not fail in flight. Air China Flight 129 has been in the air for a little less than 2 hours. Among the 155 passengers is a group of Korean tourists flying home from vacation. Their tour guide is 28-year-old Sol Ik-soo.
I had just started a new job, and my wife was 4 months pregnant.
저희 고객들이 손님들이 저하고 이제 같이 간 이제 저희 회사 여행사로 오신 분들이 한 20명 정도.
There were about 20 people traveling with our agency. I had many things to take care of.
예, 뭐 챙길 게 조금 많았던 것 같아요.
I just can't believe that happened.
열심히 회사도 다니고 그다음에 열심히 일을 해서.
I was working very hard because I had ambitions to be promoted.
내가 내 나름대로 또 사업을 갖고 싶은 욕심이 있었고 그래서 남들이 쉬거나.
I didn't take breaks and work late. I was trying my best.
더 열심히 했던 것 같습니다.
But for Sol Ik-soo, who's trying to make a good impression in his new job, today is feeling like a disaster.
I mean, what kind of person does that?
It all started to go wrong this morning when he made a mistake that he worries could get him fired.
I had arranged for the group to sit in first class. But right before we got to the airport, I realized that I'd left my passport and bag in the hotel lobby. The bus driver had to turn around and go back to the hotel.
그때 당시에 이제 버스를 타고 공항으로 가다가
The good seats were first come, first served.
여권하고 가방을 분실한 사실을 알고
Because we had to return to the hotel, my group was pushed to seats at the very back of the plane.
Sol Ik-soo has no way of knowing the far more important impact of this minor mistake.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our approach to Kimhae Airport. Local weather is foggy with some rain. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes.
Changing weather conditions are posing a challenge for the crew.
Clear to land runway 18.
Reduce speed. Okay.
Seoul Ik-soo worries that the bad weather will delay their arrival in Busan.
Let's go around! Pull up, pull up!
그런 개성이 앞에서부터
I heard people screaming.
미끄러진다는 느낌은 받았습니다.
I was sliding. I couldn't keep my body straight because the speed was too fast.
다 움직이더라고요. 거기 한 명, 두 명, 세 명. 어둠이.
Then,
실질적으로 나중에 이제 생각해서
Air China Flight 129 has crashed into the side of Mount Dae, miles from the intended runway. Of the 166 people on board, 37 survive. Almost all those who made it out alive were seated near tour guide Seoul Ik-soo.
90% of the tour group I was traveling with survived.
The fact that the young tour guide forgot his passport, something he thought was a shameful mistake, will be remembered forever as a life-saving stroke of luck. Air China Flight 129 has crashed into the side of Mount Dae, miles from the intended runway. After any plane crash near a runway, some of the first people investigators want to speak to are the air traffic controllers.
They were slated to perform a straight-in approach, but it was changed to a circling approach.
Why the sudden change?
The wind changed direction. I changed the approach so they can land into the wind.
Switching from straight-in to a circling approach is something that happens routinely at airports around the world.
Some airports, you have to come one way in because of mountains or whatever, and then once you get to the airport, because of winds, you may circle and land.
Flight 129 was originally scheduled to land on runway 36 left, coming in from the south. But after the change, they were headed for runway 18 right, coming in from the north instead.
We're closer to sea. The weather is always changing. We do this all the time.
관제탑에게 착륙 허가 요청을 했고 관제탑은
Air traffic control gave them clearance for a circling approach, which was appropriate for the weather conditions at the time.
조건하에서 서클링 랜딩을 하라고.
Is there anything else you can remember?
Communications. The radio communications were all wrong.
How do you mean?
Air China 129, contact tower 118.1, circle west.
Shortly after he instructs Flight 129 to do a circling approach, the tower controller tells the pilots to switch to a new radio frequency.
Air China 129, contact tower 118.1.
All airports use a standard frequency to communicate in emergency situations. If air traffic control even suspects a plane is in distress, they will use this frequency to contact the crew.
Kimei Tower, Air China 129, circular approach 18 right.
Air China 129, check wheels down. Wind 210 at 17 knots. Clear to land runway 18 right. They finally called me back. It seemed like we're finally back on track. Then less than a minute later, they crashed into the mountain.
The Air China crew was slow to respond to air traffic control. Investigators need to know what was going on in the cockpit during the unusual delay.
If air traffic controllers make a statement and the crew either doesn't answer or misinterprets it, it can cause the accident.
Garuda Indonesia Flight 152 left the Indonesian capital of Jakarta nearly 90 minutes ago. Headed northwest, it's expected to arrive at its destination in about half an hour.
Surface winds calm, visibility 400 meters. Present weather, smoke.
Forest fires in Sumatra have sent a thick blanket of smoke across all of Southeast Asia.
Indonesia 152, turn right heading 046.
Turn right heading 046, Indonesia 152.
Any second now, the controller expects to see Flight 152 turn onto final approach.
What?
The Airbus has somehow become dangerously close to the ground.
Come on! Climb! Climb! Climb!
Investigators gather information from the air traffic controller, the last person to have communicated with Flight 152.
They approached from the southeast. I was trying to bring them in this way. A left turn, then a right turn that gets them into runway 05.
The controller suspects the captain somehow misinterpreted his instructions and missed the final turn. With no sign of the black boxes, investigators gather air traffic recordings made in the tower. It's hoped they can shed some light on why the plane turned away from the airport instead of towards it.
Roll tape. Confirming descent to flight level 140.
The air traffic recordings capture only the radio calls between the pilots and the controller.
Indonesia 152, descend to 3,000 feet for runway 05.
They're not as helpful as a CVR recording, which would reveal all sounds and conversation inside the cockpit.
Reduce speed 220.
But investigators listen closely for any clue as to why the A300 veered so badly off course.
On heading 215, Indonesia 152.
That puts them about here, right on course. One more right turn, and he's lined up with the runway. Indonesia 152, turn right heading 046. There it is, clear as day.
Turn right heading 046, Indonesia 152.
Okay, stop there. They definitely understood. Turn right.
How the flight went so horribly wrong in the final few moments is baffling.
It's in the exact opposite direction they were told.
Investigators need the CVR if they hope to figure out what exactly went on in the cockpit of Flight 152. The crash of U.S. Air Flight 1016 is the first accident involving a major airline in North Carolina in 20 years. Both pilots and the cabin crew have survived, but of the 52 passengers, 37 are dead. Greg Feith, senior investigator with the National Transportation Safety Board, will lead the investigation.
Anytime you go to an airplane accident site, a crash site, there's always this wave of emotion. I don't care how seasoned an investigator you are, because you know that people have been seriously injured or killed in that particular event.
Examining the wreckage is the team's first task.
So what do we got?
They must determine if a loss of engine power was a factor in the crash. They examine the DC-9's two Pratt & Whitney power plants. Right away, they spot something unexpected.
Oh, look at that. The thrust reverser on this engine is deployed.
Their examination of the right engine indicated that the thrust reverser was in the deployed position and that the thrust reverser on the left engine was in the stowed position.
Thrust reversers are deployed upon landing to help slow the plane down. They work by redirecting the engine's high-powered exhaust gases forward.
If it happens in flight, that's detrimental, because if it happens on one engine, in a multi-engine airplane, you create an asymmetrical thrust situation.
Maybe that's what brought this flight down.
We've had thrust reversers deploy in flight. And depending on the speed of the aircraft, you can literally break that engine right off the aircraft.
Closer investigation reveals abrasion marks on the metal of the right side reverser. Marks that suggest a heavy impact with the ground. It's an important clue. Further analysis leads to a definitive answer. Investigators know exactly when and how the right side reverser opened.
They were able to make a determination that the reverser on that right engine, even though it was deployed, happened during the course of the impact sequence and did not happen in flight.
At least we know it wasn't thrust reversers.
Eliminating one potential cause is a step forward for investigators. But they're still a long way from understanding what brought down U.S. Air Flight 1016. Investigators need to understand why air traffic control in Charlotte didn't warn U.S. Air Flight 1016 about a fierce storm over the airport.
Oh, hey. Yeah. Good to meet you.
The air traffic controllers had more information and they could see, and they had been watching this thunderstorm for much longer than the flight crew had. So we knew very early on was going to be one of the central areas of focus to understand it.
Why did you tell the pilots the weather was good enough to land in?
The weather reports told us it was.
The controller reveals that he relied on a bulletin from the National Weather Service. It showed that conditions were well within limits for a safe landing.
I even asked a pilot who landed 4 minutes earlier how it was. US Air 983, how was the ride in your final approach?
Smooth, US Air 983.
US Air 1016, previous flight just
Exited the runway. He said it was a smooth ride.
It was fine, no problems.
The weather bulletin issued at 6:36 p.m. was indeed correct. Conditions were clear to land. But minutes later, the skies over the airport opened up and heavy rain poured down.
By the time I got to the next bulletin, it was too late.
Listen, I really appreciate your help. If I have more questions, is it all right if I call you? All right?
Sure.
Thanks.
It's now clear to investigators that weather conditions at the Charlotte airport changed very quickly. What's unclear is why the controller's weather report failed to forecast the change.
Let's see what we have here.
They studied the reports that the National Weather Service issued for Charlotte Airport that day. 6:36 p.m. Light rain showers. 6:40 p.m. Heavy rain showers. It seems the Weather Service correctly identified the change in conditions. But then, investigators make an important discovery. It took 2 minutes for the Weather Service to transmit the new information in an updated bulletin.
The problem came from the air traffic controllers not having a full body of information from the National Weather Service.
Flaps 40, please.
So they weren't providing real-time information to the flight crew.
Weather radar images soon lead to another discovery.
This is crazy. Look at that. There are 2 storm cells moving in here.
As the U.S. air pilots were trying to avoid one storm formation,
1840,
another storm cell,
1842,
suddenly increased in intensity.
They were blindsided.
Here come the wipers.
The late weather report left the crew unprepared for the sudden downpour. The critical question now, was the rainstorm strong enough to knock Flight 1016 out of the sky? Salvage crews pull what remains of TransAsia Flight 235 from the Keelung River. There's no telling which piece of wreckage might hold an important clue. Investigators wonder if the flight control system shows any sign of a malfunction.
Nothing wrong with this actuator.
We cannot find anything wrong with the actuator, the linkage of the control.
Control system seems fine.
A search for any pre-impact failures in the plane's hydraulic system also comes up empty.
Nothing wrong with the hydraulics. Is this the left engine?
Yes.
Investigators know from the dash cam video that the plane was banked steeply to the left. A mechanical fault with the left engine seems like the next most obvious suspect.
We need to take a look inside. Get the borescope?
From a borescope examination, we can see whether or not the compressor and turbine are damaged on the inside. Since the turbine rotates with extremely high speed, if it is even slightly damaged, it will be completely destroyed.
But the borescope examination yields no new clues.
Left engine completely operational. Strange.
They need to explore other possibilities.
What about the right engine? Let's go take a look.
They study the right engine. And what they find is mystifying.
Look at the blades. They're feathered.
Feathered is a propeller's fail-safe position. When a propeller engine loses power in flight, the blades automatically rotate parallel to the airstream to reduce drag. The discovery only deepens the mystery.
Why would the right engine be feathered when the dash cam video clearly shows the plane banking to the left?
It doesn't make any sense.
Let's have a look.
When we discover a feather of the propeller, we know there should be something wrong about the engine.
Anything?
Nothing at all.
Both engines yielded normal results after examination. They were both fine.
There's nothing wrong with this engine either.
If both engines were operational, well, why did this plane crash?
It's just before 6 a.m. at Sharm el-Sheikh Airport in Egypt. 217 passengers are headed to St. Petersburg, Russia, some 4 hours away. At 5:51 a.m., Metrojet Flight 9268 lifts into the air.
The aircraft took off in a standard way. No problems with the takeoff.
Flight 9268 reaches cruising altitude, 31,000 feet above the Sinai Peninsula. All is going smoothly at air traffic control until 6:13 a.m. when Flight 9268 does something unexpected. The Airbus seems to be dropping.
Metrojet 9268, are you experiencing any difficulties?
Do you read me, Metrojet 9268?
Then all of a sudden, everything just dropped off. At the altitude, just dropped and disappeared.
Do you read me?
As rescuers arrive on the scene, it soon becomes clear that there are no survivors.
Airbus aircraft just simply do not fall out of the sky. So that gets everyone's ears perked up on what happened here.
Really?
There are rumors this was a terrorist attack.
Right there. Take a look at this.
A terrorist group affiliated with Islamic State, fighting to seize territory across the Middle East, claims responsibility for bringing down Metrojet 9268. They say it was in retaliation for Russian military attacks in Syria. Though there is no proof to back up the claim, there's speculation that attackers used a surface-to-air missile.
When I looked at the debris field, I kept thinking right again. Another catastrophic, shocking crash as a result of an ignition device hitting the aircraft.
After the fall of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, militants raided his weapons depots, flooding the region with Russian-made shoulder-mounted missile launchers. Investigators need to know if those weapons are powerful enough to hit an airliner at cruising altitude.
These are the missiles they're using. The plane was flying at 31,000 feet. What's the range on those missiles?
I was just looking at the specs.
Check it out.
They study military documents and make some quick calculations. They soon have their answer.
It's not possible. Not with the weapons they have.
It was too high of an altitude to be a surface-to-air missile. There was good reason for people to speculate initially that this could have been a surface-to-air missile. That group has used a surface-to-air missile before, specifically in early 2014 to shoot down successfully an Egyptian helicopter.
The first officer's wife is being interviewed.
На тот момент еще никто не понимал, точно ли это или нет. Все еще как бы были в ожидании.
What's she saying? I can't understand a word. They spoke with the father just before he flew out of Sharm el-Sheikh. And what did he say? He said there were mechanical issues with the plane.
I did see reports of family members quoting that safety was dubious on this aircraft.
There's only one way to find out.
The fact that the aircraft may have had a lot of problems, you'd have to firstly find out what those problems were, and secondly, are they relevant to what we know has happened?
Excuse me.
Investigators speak with the aircraft engineer who last serviced the airplane at Sharm el-Sheikh Airport.
What can you tell us about Metrojet 9268?
We serviced it for 30 minutes before takeoff.
Doesn't sound like a long time.
That is a quick turnaround, and low-cost carriers sometimes have to do that.
They work their people hard to turn the aircraft around fast so that that aircraft is in the air as many hours of the day as it possibly can be, earning money for them.
The aircraft was 18 years old. It had been through several different owners. But maintenance engineers insist that the plane was mechanically sound.
Significant incidents maybe in the past, something like that.
It had a tail strike in 2001.
A tail strike is when the rear fuselage of a plane hits the runway during takeoff or landing. Damage can be minor or severe depending on the force of the impact. Maintenance records show that the tail strike damage was repaired. Investigators now wonder if a tail strike repair from 14 years ago may have fatally weakened the Metrojet Airbus. The shattered remains of Metrojet 9268 have been moved from the Sinai Desert to a massive warehouse in Cairo.
Let me take a look at this.
Investigators hope the collected debris can tell them if an improper tail strike repair from years ago doomed Metrojet Flight 9268. They sort through tail pieces from the Metrojet Airbus. They focus on the ones that were repaired because of the tail strike incident.
If any mistakes or shortcuts are made during the repair, then that tends to put abnormal or uneven stresses on various parts of the metal structure, and that starts the process of metal fatigue, and you get cracks.
Fatigue has, certainly to the trained investigator, has quite distinctive characteristics.
No signs of damage around the repair. Something else caused it.
Before long, they also rule out engine failure and all other mechanical failures. It seems there was nothing wrong with the aircraft.
It just doesn't make sense.
It's been almost 48 hours since Thai Airways Flight 311 disappeared in the Himalayas. Investigators have yet to find the aircraft. But now they're about to get an important break. Local villagers report that they found aircraft debris north of Kathmandu. The reported crash site is nowhere near the area they've been searching.
I don't think they ever, in their wildest imagination, thought the airplane was north of the airport.
North of Kathmandu, near the border with Tibet, the Himalayan peaks soar to an altitude of 20,000 feet. These northern summits are the reason almost all planes approach Tribhuvan Airport from the south, where the mountains are closer to 8,000 feet. Later that day, 27 miles north of Kathmandu, search crews find the remains of Thai Airways Flight 311. The point of impact is a steep rock face more than 11,000 feet up the side of a remote mountain. None of the 113 people on board have survived. The challenge for investigators is unlike anything they've encountered before. The terrain is so extreme, helicopters can't land near the impact zone. The team will have to trek more than 3,000 feet up from the base camp to reach the wreckage. It's a treacherous 5-hour hike. The team includes experts from around the world, including Canada's David Rohrer.
The level of destruction was enormous. You couldn't tell that you had an Airbus A310 aircraft there. I mean, you couldn't even tell you had two engines.
The first big question they have is, how did Thai Airways Flight 311 end up here? The Airbus should never have been flying north of the airport.
Right over there.
An airport hangar in Kathmandu is the final stop on a long journey for wreckage collected from the mountainside.
The Sherpas would bring down the pieces that we identified down to the landing zone. Then the Nepalese army and their helicopters would put them in nets and then sling them down to the hangar at the airport.
As team members comb through the wreckage, the investigation takes an unexpected turn.
Excuse me. Can I help you?
During the investigation, one of the family members was asking for a circuit board just because they somehow would link them to their loved one.
The unusual request leads to an incredible find.
That's when we actually found the internal mechanism of the recorder we were missing, which was quite amazing.
The FDR should provide crucial data on the plane's speed, direction, and altitude throughout the flight.
You always hope that luck is on your side, that things will happen to your benefit, and those are the kind of moments you really hope for as an investigator.
It's the breakthrough they've been waiting for. Evidence that could reveal how a plane flying south of the airport ended up slamming into mountains to its north.